Good morning and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us, depending on where you're dialing in from, right? So thanks so much for joining us for another panel for the Asia Briefing Live. My name is Yvonne, your moderator for the next 60 minutes or so. Just want to thank Asia Society for having me take part in this great event here today. Before we start things off, I'd like to acknowledge that there are many participants in today's events that are coming in and dialing in from locations that have traditional custodians and owners. I pay my respects to elders, the past, the present, and emerging. I also want to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people that are dialing in and joining our forum today. I also want to encourage you to watch our full Welcome to Country. It was delivered from Melbourne by the Wurundjeri elder Uncle Colin Hunter. That's accessible on our main forum platform. You also want to find a welcome message there and check that out from Asia Society and other pre-recorded content that is available to watch. About this session, this panel brings in a lot of leading intellectuals to kind of assess what's been going on geopolitically right now and geoeconomically. The tensions that we're seeing in the region and basically explore how Australia is going to be navigating these two very important international relationships, perhaps the most important relationships that it has internationally with the US and China. To discuss all this, I want to bring in our stunning panel here today. Joining us is Michaela Browning, the former Chief Executive Officer at the National Foundation for China-Australia Relations. She joins us from Canberra, Australia. Daojiong, a Professor of International Political Economy from Peking University, joining us from Beijing, China this morning. And Bonny Lin, Director for the China Power Project and Senior Fellow for Asian Security at CSIS, joining us from Washington, D.C. And Orville Schell, Arthur Ross, Director of Center on U.S.-China Relations at Asia Society, and he joins us from New York. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I encourage you, of course, to read their full bios there. That's going to be on the left-hand side of your screen. You're going to see some of the speaker headshots and a little bit more about their backgrounds there. All right, just want to remind you this is an interactive session as well, despite the fact that we're virtual still. We still want you guys involved. And we're going to kick things off today with a polling question just to see how everyone feels about where geopolitical tensions and where these relationships lie right now. This is the first question that we are asking to the audience today. How would you rate the Australian government's management of its relationship with China? A, total mismanagement. B, clumsy and inconsistent. C, pass. D, good considering the circumstances. And E, superb handling. Go for it. If you don't know where to go, just make sure to check the bar chart icon that's on the left-hand side of your screen as well. All right, this is what we're getting so far. I think close to half of you guys are still thinking it's clumsy and inconsistent right now. I think about the second biggest group is about good considering the consequences. But yes, there's still about 25% of you that still think it's total mismanagement right now. So obviously there's still a lot of answers that we need to get answered during this panel. I encourage you to ask questions as well. There's going to be some time towards the end of the panel to ask some Q&A. If you want to submit some questions, you can join us on social media as well. There's a chat function on your screen, and make sure to use the hashtag as well. If you're tweeting or posting things on Instagram, hashtag Asia Briefing Live. All right, I got through all the housekeeping. Let's talk a little bit more about just where sentiment is right now. It seems like most people are thinking it's between clumsy and a little bit of mismanagement, but considering the circumstances, it's all right now, Australia's handling of relations. I'm going to start with Bonny as well as Professor Jia. How would you characterize the U.S.-China relationship in 2021, and what do you think are the best and worst case scenarios? I'll start with you, Bonny.
Yvonne, thank you very much for this question, and thank you also for the invitation to Asia Society and Bloomberg. In terms of the U.S.-China relationship, I would characterize it as a multifaceted relationship with elements of competition as well as elements of interdependence. I would say given the events of this week, including escalated tensions in the Taiwan Strait, with China flying significant numbers of aircraft into Taiwan's ADIZ, USTR Ambassador Catherine Tai's remarks that helped lay out the U.S. administration's approach towards its economic relationship with China. And of course, most recently, the meeting between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Politburo member Yang Jiechi. I would say that the relationship is now entering a stage of recalibration as the two sides explore how best to manage the relationship and keep open lines of communication, even as there are and will remain significant differences between the two sides. I think it's a bit hard to forecast the best and worst case scenarios. Hopefully, a potential positive outcome from all of these meetings and developments that we're seeing in the past couple of days is that the two governments can resume official dialogues and engagements beyond the working level, and the two sides can maintain open lines of communication. Perhaps we could see some engagement in cooperation on climate change. I would note that on the econ side, Ambassador Tai's remarks left a lot of flexibility on the various possible directions that the United States could take on the economic side. This includes, on one hand, tariff exclusions, as well as on the other hand, exploring a range of new economic tools to address the consequences of the trade imbalance with China.
Professor Zhao?
Well, I approach this question with a sense of a tough love. We need to be straightforward. The relationship, in terms of the worst case scenario I listed, it would have been either or both Beijing and Washington going around to third countries and tell them either it's American vaccine or Chinese vaccine. You don't have a choice. We have avoided that. As I said, that may not be the most diplomatic, but that would be a very low bar of normalcy. I'm very harsh on this, but that's what we need to be. But there are some positive signs. China and the United States avoided making issues like Myanmar and Afghanistan bilateral. If you leave this to these hawks on both sides, they would really create havoc for just about anyone. Now we need to be wary of some cheap talk, such as recoupling. We need to go back to, for each side, to have more introspection, self-reflection, self-constraint, and self-control. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor. On that note, let's bring in Orville into the conversation as well. And Orville, what do you think the Biden presidency means for Australia right now and other middle powers in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think the United States finds itself in sort of uncharted waters. Our old policy of engagement, which really, I think, did try to temper the relationship and not foresee China's rise as being in any ways harmful to our own well-being, that is over. And I think our relationship with Australia now, as we can see with AUKUS, the default posture of the United States is to look for partners and allies in the Pacific and indeed around the world to consolidate a fabric to resist what I think many in America are coming to see as increasingly aggressive and unrepentant postures by China, to wit in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, the South China Sea, towards the Diaojiong, Senkaku Islands, and Japan. So I think we are in a very fraught moment, and the relationship has been in something of a free fall, although now Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi will meet in Switzerland, and we have a brief halt, I think, and we hope that they will be able to come up with something. But one dare not be too optimistic here. I think it's quite a confrontational, adversarial relationship.
Yeah, as you mentioned, that meeting between Sullivan and Yang Jiechi, it's come a long way since what we saw in Alaska, but certainly, as you talked about, still a lot of lingering tensions there. Michaela, sandwiched between all that is Australia, right? How do you think Canberra should actually manage the U.S. and China relationship right now? And how do you think Australia's fractured relationship with Beijing is viewed globally if you look at the U.S., Europe, and Southeast Asia?
Well, thank you. It's a very big question. And look, I'm coming to this event today as an Australian official and somebody who's been tasked with thinking about our long-term practical engagement with China into the future. So I'm going to bring a particular lens to my answer, and I don't think I'll get to all of it, including what other countries think of how we're responding to the circumstances. But how is Australia managing these two really important relationships, China and the US? Look, there's actually a lot of continuity in how Australia is looking at this through the policy lens. And that is through careful and independent consideration of our own national interests. Because we are an Indo-Pacific country, what happens in this region really directly impacts us, and we benefit from an open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And we want to contribute to rules of the road that enable us to continue to pursue our national interests in an open and inclusive set of rules. We're a trading nation, so we've always been at the forefront of open, fair, sustainable trading rules and arrangements. And so you see a continuation of that, including through things like RCEP, CP, TPP, and evolving to new circumstances like the Singapore-Australia digital trade agreement. And also we're a democracy and a sovereign state, and we want to safeguard those very things that are so critical to us. So how are we doing it? We're continuing to support our enduring and important alliance with the United States, and we've seen development in that regard through AUKUS, but we also continue to emphasise and build on those really significant strategic partnerships that we have with Indonesia, with India, with Japan, and through other regional arrangements. And we're continuing to support, as I said, those open and inclusive trading rules that will enable us to continue to trade fairly and sustainably into the future and defend our interests through those arrangements when we have to, and continue to advocate for countries that sign up to those rules and arrangements to abide by them in the interests of everybody, because they've underpinned our prosperity and our stability in the region for the last many, many decades. On China specifically, our trade minister and others have said we're taking a 3 Ps approach, which is principled, patient and proactive. The Australian government consistently says that we value the enormously important relationship that we have with China. It is still our biggest trading partner, notwithstanding the significant challenges and indeed trade actions which have adversely affected a number of Australians, a number of businesses, and I want to acknowledge that. We continue to remain open to dialogue, to pursue our interests through open trading arrangements. And one of my job for the last little while has been to support and develop the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations to really think about where can we have constructive, mutually beneficial engagement with China that is in our national interests as well. And there's a great many areas, and it's not just in trade. If we think about all of the global challenges, be it climate change, environmental issues, digital disruption, aging population, chronic diseases, these are all areas where we can work with China constructively in really important ways, and our people-to-people links are enormously extensive. And so my job has been to think about how do we support the enduring, strong engagement that we still do have with China, and what other ways can we engage with China into the future, but also build our own resilience, build our own understanding, and defend our interests.
And Bonny, how do you think Indo-Pacific nations are adapting to what is looking to be a much more confrontational U.S. and China relationship? What sort of response are you seeing?
I'm seeing a range of different responses. So on one hand, we see many regional countries are quite wary, quite cautious of what they view as potential very negative and destabilizing implications of intense U.S.-China competition. They don't want to be stuck in the middle of this U.S.-China competition. They don't want to be awkwardly having to choose sides. So in that respect, I think many countries would welcome more high-level engagements between the United States and China, and welcome ways in which the two sides can be able to identify areas to cooperate, including in some of the areas that Michaela mentioned, for example, climate change and maybe potentially Afghanistan. On the other hand, we're also seeing different countries take different responses to specific U.S. and Chinese activities. So I mentioned earlier the increasing Chinese military pressure against Taiwan, which has created quite a bit of concern in the region. So Australia has emphasized the need to resolve issues like Taiwan using peaceful means. We've also seen Japan in the past week echo the Australian view, but even go a step further to say that instead of just simply monitoring the situation, Japan hopes to weigh up all possible scenarios with respect to Taiwan and to consider options that Japan may have. Similarly, when we look at the opposite side of U.S. activities, as well as U.S. activities with allies and partners, Michaela mentioned AUKUS, right? So Japan and Singapore were and are quite supportive of this. Malaysia and Indonesia have voiced a range of concerns. President Duterte of the Philippines was initially supportive, and now he's voiced concerned. So you can see there's not a one regional response to U.S. or Chinese activities. It's very much a mixed response from the region, and it's also a case-by-case response to specific U.S., specific Chinese activities.
Yeah, I think most people are talking about with AUKUS and Quad, it really kind of changes the whole geopolitics and the playing field in the region as well. Orville, I want to kind of get you involved in here. Professor Jha did talk about how we have to be wary of cheap talk. He mentioned about the recoupling and whatnot. What would a decouple of China and the U.S. look like, do you think? How damaging would that be for the U.S. economy? And do you see any big impact on the Australian economy?
Well, I think clearly the Australians are as acquainted as anyone with the notion of decoupling, with the exception of iron ore. There have been a lot of sectors of your economy that have been decoupled. The United States, I think, finds itself in the interesting position of where it's really China as much as the United States that's decoupling. China's economy is seeking to become more and more independent, more and more autarkic, and less reliant, particularly technologically, on Western democracies. And so I think that it is true, as Bonny says, countries like Korea and certainly Australia a year ago would rather not have had to choose. They would rather play both sides, be on both sides, and have a nice friendly middle ground to stand on. I think the thing that's striking to me, having watched this relationship for 50, 60 years, is the middle ground is melting away from underneath people's feet. And Korea is going to have to get used to it. Australia has gotten used to it. And you may not like it, but that is the result, I think, largely of actions that are being taken in China, which are pushing countries to decide, even though they don't want to decide. And if that process can be arrested, I think it would be a very salutary thing. Am I optimistic that it can in Switzerland, coming up with Sullivan and Yang Jiechi? Frankly, no.
Michaela, what would a U.S. and China decoupling mean for Australia, the economic impact, and could it actually reverse some kind of economic recovery that we see coming out of COVID? Oh, I think you're on mute, Michaela.
Thank you for the question. Sorry about that. Firstly, I think we need to think about what do we mean by decoupling. And, you know, some people talk about wholesale decoupling, but we've had USTR just this last week say that's just not realistic. A number of people talk about just technological or maybe capital markets decoupling in certain ways. I think what we are seeing, and I don't think wholesale decoupling is possible, and neither possible nor desirable in Australia's case. We've benefited enormously from engagement with both China and the US. They're our very significant trading partners. China's our largest trading partner and continues to be. However, what we are seeing, and it's not just for Australia, but many countries and indeed in China and the US itself, is countries re-examining some of their policy settings and thinking particularly about things like supply chain vulnerabilities and resilience for a range of reasons, not just because of strategic competition, but including, you know, in the pandemic context, because some of the risks and factors that we're thinking of in terms of our own national interests and our national security were very much brought home to us all, and things like supplies of PPE, for example. And we are seeing a number of policies and developments, including by China and the US, but also elsewhere, around things like critical technologies, critical infrastructure, critical minerals, public health and safety, where those provisions that had always been caveats in all our trading arrangements around national security, public health and safety are being reviewed and redefined in new ways. And what we're also seeing is accelerating regulatory and other changes, particularly in our region. And we're seeing policy settings that are driving some decoupling, particularly around data and cybersecurity and other things in our region. But we're also seeing businesses make their own decisions because of a review of their risk and reward assessments in light of these really tectonic and major shifts that we're seeing in the region, not just because of strategic competition, but indeed because of climate change, because of digital disruption and other sorts of things. Look, for Australia and China, if I can just say again, there is still an enormous amount of engagement that continues to take place. It is still a major trading partner for Australia. And one of my jobs has been to think about where engagement is productive, meaningful, constructive in the national interest and to the mutual benefit of Australia and China. And actually, despite significant challenges that we've seen for a variety of reasons, there are still a lot of opportunities and there is still a lot of engagement taking place. But I do think, and indeed the Trade Minister and the Australian government has said to Australian business, you need to really do your due diligence. You really do need to think about the changes that are happening in the region. And that is why we're taking a China Plus approach as well on this.
And Bonny, you've talked just a little bit here and there about the military might that we're seeing in the region right now. You talked about these flybys that Beijing made in Taiwan, these naval drills we're seeing of the US, the UK, and Japan in recent days. Are military tensions likely to escalate, and what could go wrong?
Sure. I definitely do see military tensions in the region as continue to increase for a couple of reasons. The first is we still have many unresolved territorial disputes in the region that continue to sustain and drive countries to take various actions to claim their disputed territories or to advance their claims. And I would point out that China is involved in most of these territorial disputes, where China is pitted usually against a key U.S. ally or partner. At the same time, we're also seeing that China and regional countries are investing more in their capabilities. Compared to regional countries, China has been able to invest significantly more than most regional militaries. And what you're seeing is China is becoming more confident and more willing to press for its claims. As Orville mentioned earlier, there is a sense that as China has become more confident in its capabilities, as China has become more powerful, that China is increasingly bullying its neighbors. It's being more assertive too as a result of its confidence and capabilities. So what we're seeing as a result of this is that the US and many of our key allies and partners, including other Western countries such as Canada, France, and the UK, were becoming much more active in the Indo-Pacific region to reassure our allies and partners, but also to deter potential Chinese military coercion. This then has created a cycle in which China perceives US activities as aggressive and offensive, and then responds by engaging in more military exercises or other military activities to counter US allied and partner operations in the region. So I would say the general dynamic is one of a escalation dynamic in the region in which China acts against a US ally and partner, US increases our operations, working with allies and partners, and then China responds. So it's in many ways not a virtuous cycle. It's more of a escalation spiral that we're seeing.
Wow. Yeah, and Professor Jia, how do you think China's foreign policy and domestic politics are responding to what the U.S. is doing and perhaps the West as well, this increased pushback from the West? And how do you think that impacts Australia?
As you may have sensed, I have stayed away from referring to specifics. I feel distressed, not just on this particular occasion, that people often fail to recognize that they are actually hijacking themselves into on a train of self-crash, because they only assign blame to the other side. We have to begin by recognizing that we have different chronologies, we have different understandings of cause and effect, without any sort of empathy to take in the other side's position. These kind of exercises are not going to be very meaningful, either at an academic level or so-called civil society level, or much less at an official level. We have seen this on display. I don't like the term pushback, nor do I like such terms as emerging or emerging economy, emergence. There are many academic papers written about that. When you start to identify someone as emerging, you're really saying there's a trouble. It should have been flat for me. There's something, a roadblock on the side. I must kick it away. That's confrontational. That's going out to look for trouble, to have frictions. So I would think at this point of time, to answer the questions like this, I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm trying to invite an alternative mode of thinking about this. We have to look at how do we understand another side's interest. Is it through the public expressions, or is it something that's salient, that even whether or not it's articulated or not, and there is that problem of translation? The third is most important. Is it sometimes that we interpret it, we meaning one unilaterally, and that can be imposed understanding of the other side's interest. Let me try to say one more word about China, Australia, then I'll stop. Along that line of thinking, it's fertile to claim, well, which side wronged which side. Both the Chinese side and the Australian side, if it's for their own respective good, or to come back, sit back and probably talk to themselves first. What indeed happened that brought us to this stage? The two countries never really had any sort of reason to do this. China and Japan, Australia are different from China and Japan. But how do we end up with a situation where Australia feels, that it must take a military approach, or the Chinese side feels, oh, are we having a second Japan to deal with? And that sort of sentiment, the societal level sentiment, goes a long way it defines this talk when we use either autocracy, democracy, all those political science terms. At the end of the day, why do you want to have foreign relations? It's to serve your own people, to make them happy. To not happy, not in the sense of having an enemy far or close to your country. Let me stop here.
And maybe I'll do a follow-up there, Professor Jia, because you mentioned it's much more nuanced, right, depending on which country and their relationship with China. What then do you think is the biggest misunderstanding that people have or the international community has with Beijing right now?
Well, I'm an academic person. When you mention the word Beijing, I think you're referring to government. You're referring to the official positions. That's not my job. And I would, your question caught me off guard. I think the large misunderstanding is that, as I said earlier on, there is a big bit of imposition of Chinese interest. That is somehow China or the Chinese polity or the Chinese people is out there to revenge against the so-called 2 century of humiliation. It's out there to dominate. It's out there to return to some sort of tributary system. I think that's probably what it is. Let me. There is a time element here. I don't want to dominate.
No worries. I just wanted to kind of get your take on that. Michaela, I guess this brings us to the next question of how you kind of mentioned it about how Australia can better juggle its relationship with China and at least maintain some sort of economic engagement amidst these tensions. Do you think that this relationship with China can stabilize, or should Australia even try?
Well, of course. I think, how can Australia best manage its relationship with Australia? And just reflecting on what the professor has just said, I mean, firstly, with understanding and appreciating the value and importance of this relationship. I mean, it's important to Australia bilaterally, but how China wants to be and engage with the world is going to affect all of us, not just Australia. How China's economy performs, how it develops, how it innovates is going to affect all of us. So, I mean, it starts with an appreciation of the value, and importance and significance of the relationship. And as I said, through a really careful consideration of our own national interests and what is to our mutual benefit. And Australia has consistently said that we welcome China's rise, that its prosperity is something which is enormously positive. It has significantly benefited Australia, but Australia has also contributed to that. There's a huge amount of value there. There are a lot of shared interests that we still have, and there's a lot of continuing engagement, but there are really significant challenges. And so I think that we need to look at it through the lens of our national interests really clearly and objectively, and find ways to practically engage where that's meaningful for both sides, and to build trust and confidence, and to work with our partners and others in the region around a set of rules and behaviours that are in the best interests of all of us. And those are where we have an open, stable, peaceful Indo-Pacific where fair and sustainable trade is possible.
And thank you, Michaela. And Bonny, I was going to get to you about how do you think the Chinese diaspora deal with the tense bilateral ties that we're seeing right now and concerns about foreign interference?
Sure, Yvonne, that's a really good question. So I guess before I directly answer that question, I think it's important when you're talking about the Chinese diaspora to really specify what you're talking about. So I think it's important to differentiate the Chinese government from the Chinese people, which you can define as the Chinese citizens, which are still further different from ethnic Chinese people who might be citizens of a different country. So I think when you're talking about the diaspora, you're referring to both Chinese citizens living outside of China, as well as ethnic Chinese people who are living in different countries who might not be Chinese citizens. So I would say, at least in the United States, and I would imagine it's probably the same in Australia, it's not easy being a Chinese American, as well as it's not easy being individuals of Asian descent. Part of this is, as we saw during the pandemic, select politicians, particularly in the United States, have targeted Asian Americans for various problems relating to COVID-19, related to somewhat to what China's been, the attribution of and linkage of China with COVID-19, but also the general competition with China has made Asian Americans more of a target. According to some of the latest statistics I've seen on this, the number of reported hate crimes against Asians have increased by over 70% in 2020 compared to 2019. In some ways, then, as a result of this, Asian Americans and Chinese Americans have had to prove or at least demonstrate their loyalty to the United States more than some of the other types of Americans. But I do want to flag another flip side of this is that the Chinese government, Beijing, does seek to leverage ethnic Chinese, including Chinese Americans, to push for PRC interests. I've had many conversations with Chinese American friends in which they've been called various unpleasant names by Chinese colleagues because there's a view that if you're ethnically Chinese and your heritage at some point comes from China, that should dominate how you view China, and that should actually make you want to support your motherland to become strong and prosperous again. So I think the Chinese diaspora, they're in a relatively tricky situation, whether that's in the United States, Australia, or elsewhere.
And Professor Jia, can you talk a little bit more about China and how they view nations like middle powers like Australia that are converging with security initiatives like AUKUS, like Quad? What's been the response so far?
I'm looking at my notes that I wrote beforehand. 3 quick points. The notion of a middle power in world politics is problematic. It sort of comes in with a prescribed hierarchy about understanding which country is fittingly doing what. I don't quite like it. I think that's one of the bad contributions standard international relations textbook makes to our lives. And secondly, countries are free to associate. That includes Australia, no matter how you frame it. A third point on my note is that Quad is slowly evolving to take shape, and especially in relation to public health, the collaborative action to develop and distribute vaccines for different societies. That's what's needed. I don't have much else to say about Quad. But I do want to go back to what Bonny earlier was saying about the so-called Chinese influence, the ethnic Chinese communities, the diasporas around the world. We need to be extremely careful about this. I myself stayed overseas and I work with this. When you this kind of vocabulary of influence, seemingly neutral terms, you are really putting people's lives in, that sort of phraseology in jeopardy. Either you host them and treat them, with as little racial bias as possible, or you tell them to go away. These are people who contribute
Michaela,
to your society. And I was quite distressed to hear some of these kind of broad, sometimes you start to magnify a individual incident, and you forget to look at the institutional context where something's happened, but to drag individuals, to drag communities of residents, migrants around the world into this sort of high abstract politics, geopolitics of competition. That's not very responsible way of doing things.
All right, we don't have much time left, but I just wanted to maybe ask one more question to Michaela before we get some Q&A as well. Michaela, do you think Australia should continue to diversify its economy away from China, and is it really possible?
Well, thank you for the question. Look, I think I mentioned that our Trade Minister has been talking about a 3Ps approach to China, but also a China Plus strategy. So it doesn't mean diversify away from China. It means that encouraging and promoting and engaging with other countries in our region and other markets, including because of pressure points that Australia's sustained and has needed to find other markets, including for things like barley and looking at wine and other sorts of things like this. So, look, I don't think it's an either or scenario here, but I think a China Plus strategy is an appropriate one. And in fact, it's just sensible for countries to think about diversifying their markets and exposures and thinking about their resilience as well, including around things I mentioned before, PPE or critical technologies or critical minerals, these sorts of things. And they've long been good trade policies to think about, and that is why Australia has for decades, in fact, been at the forefront of initiatives like APEC or CPTPP or RCEP, or trying to think about how do we cultivate as many markets as possible, and how do we support and promote rules that our partners will also support and abide by, so that we can all benefit and prosper.
Great. One last question. This is for all of our panelists here today. Given the fact that we have travel that's been restricted, it's very difficult to have people-to-people exchange these days. Does Australia have any levers left to try to maintain that people-to-people relationship with China? And is there a space for Australia's soft power efforts when it comes to China, in China as well? Orville, we haven't heard from you in a while, so I'll let you just kick things off.
Well, I think people-to-people relations are always helpful. But of course, the pandemic has put a stake through the heart of that proposition. It's very difficult now for anyone to go anywhere. So it's very difficult to rely on that. But I think also that given the climate in which I think Australia and certainly the United States now exist in with China, it is ever more difficult to have any kind of a contact. Visas are difficult to get. Cultural exchanges are sensitive. Their civil society is really being shut out of China. So there's so many different kinds of musculatures that we once took for granted that help keep relationships up that in a non-governmental way. And business, of course, would be certainly one of these that are difficult, more difficult now than before, and not simply because of the pandemic. So I think we have to lament that and recognize that this is not a very strong member of our support system anymore.
I'll try to fuse what I just asked, this question, also with a viewer question as well about what are the factors that could lead to a significant change in the current U.S., Australia, China relationship that could actually lead to reducing geopolitical tensions, and in effect, how likely is that going to change? So if anyone can kind of fuse all that in, I'll get you guys to answer. Bonny, I'll get you to talk next.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's an incredibly difficult question. I can't think of one or two things that would significantly alter whether it's the U.S.-China relationship or the China-Australia relationship. I do want to point out that I don't think people-to-people exchanges are on hold. I think travel is on hold. But what we're having here today is still, I would call, a good exchange using a virtual platform. So I'm probably a little bit less pessimistic than Orville is on in terms of what type of exchanges can occur or what's not allowed. I do think there's a significant space for virtual exchanges, even though they're nowhere as great as in person. In terms of what at least Australia can do with respect to its soft power and China, your original question, Yvonne, I think one area that Australia could do is to strike the right balance between the policies towards Chinese Australians that balance legitimate Australian national security concerns about potential PRC interference with singling out Chinese Australians as an exception or different from other Australians. So I think as long as Australia makes Australia a very attractive place for Chinese citizens to want to come live, study, and work, I think that will give Australia significant soft power when it comes to how Chinese people view Australia.
Professor Jia? Oh, you're on mute, Professor.
I would call soft power impact and source of learning, not the sort of influence as defined in political circles, especially these days. So when you think about that way, it goes both ways, China and Australia, China and United States. Now, between China and Australia, what has been, Bonny earlier alluded to that, what has been sorrowfully missing is a real effort on both sides. Let me emphasize on both sides to relate to the mainstream. What I mean is that too few here in China relate to non-ethnic Chinese in Australia, and part of that is language or cultural factors, but that sometimes contributes to aggregating political sensitivities on the Australian side. But then on the Australian side, as I have observed, I'm one of the very few folks here studying international relations in China who actually follow Australian events fairly closely, is that there is selective listening on the Australian side as well. There's not a genuine, as much a broad and genuine effort to relate to what I would call the mainstream views on the Chinese side. Between China and the U.S., that's a lot better. We can go on and on for why. But to your question, what can happen in terms of dealing with the hypertension in geopolitics among China, the United States, and Australia? I would think let's give time. How to say it? Let's not be more anxious, drive us more nuts. Time will take care of it. Keep some bottom line of saying, conflict is costly. Talk can lead to binding your own hands into having to fire that first shot. But I would think that, again, let me repeat that China, the United States, Australia, it's about time to self-reflect and watch your own next step, with or without the other side saying anything or doing anything. I think that's critical.
And Michaela, I'll let you have the final word.
Thank you. And if I can endorse some of the suggestions that have been made, but I think, look, it's just enormously important to have constructive dialogue and goodwill in terms of managing relationships, and to be investing in institutional relationships and partnerships that allow you to come together around important areas wherever you can. And the reason why I took on this job for the last year and a half with the foundation is because of the opportunity to look for those areas of long-term practical engagement that are so obviously in our mutual interests, and where I think it's absolutely possible to engage and to rebuild a lot of trust and confidence around areas of shared interests, and that is going to be a patient endeavour. And I do think that bringing constructive dialogue, using consistent and careful messaging, all of these things are going to be important. On the people-to-people links, these are really so extensive. And, I was most recently Consul General in Hong Kong, and just reflecting on 200 years of Chinese migration to Australia, the significant contribution that's been made, how that helped build the bedrock of a lot of understanding and capability that fed into our engagement with the region more generally, not just with Hong Kong, but in fact through the Chinese diaspora throughout our region. And those links have been enormously important to Australia's development and our history. And I think Australia does and should recognise the value and contribution that has been made, and ensure that we are supporting all Australians to participate in Australian public life and reach their full potential and make that important contribution. So just to acknowledge also those concerns that have been raised about the impact on Chinese diaspora, Chinese Australians and Asian Australians as well, and the importance of all of us working together.
All right. To end on a very hopeful note, I like that. So thank you so much to Michaela, Professor Jia, Bonny, as well as Orville. We covered a lot here, so there's a lot of ground that we covered, and I want to thank everyone for joining here today as we wrap up this session. A reminder that we will be streaming live all day for Asia Briefing Live, and I encourage you to join our next public session as well. That's going to be with the ambassadors of the Quad on this platform. That starts 12 o'clock if you're joining on the Australian Eastern Daylight Time. So kind of taking the next level with what we just discussed here today, discussing more on the Quad. Thank you and goodbye.